Have you ever trusted someone so much that it never crossed your mind that one day you might be betrayed? My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm 42 years old, and until recently, I believed my marriage was rock solid. I was that woman everyone looked at in church and said, "What a blessed couple. What an example of Christian union." I believed this with all my heart. We did everything together: ministry, events, counseling other couples. I lived and breathed this partnership, which, for me, was sustained by God. But what I didn't know is that while I smiled at people, something was being built in the shadows. That night, I was excited. We had a special couple service at church. Beautiful praise, inspiring words, hands held during prayer. I looked at the man beside me and felt proud, at least, until I noticed those subtle details that, if you've ever been there, stir our instincts. The distant gaze, the divided attention, the short answers. I tried to ignore it. After all, who would suspect a husband who preaches about fidelity and commitment? But something inside me began to bother me, and it was there, in the place I least expected, that my life turned upside down. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because it's not just about betrayal. It's about abandonment, judgment, and most of all, the silence they tried to impose on me. Stay with me until the end, because what happened that night still echoes in my mind as if it were yesterday. It all started with an innocent comment from a friend, something I couldn't quite interpret at the time, but which would open the door to a truth no one in the church wanted revealed. And when I finally saw it with my own eyes, there was no turning back. The trust I'd spent years building was shattered in minutes, and the woman who walked out of that church that night was no longer the same woman who walked in. I used to wake up every day with that feeling of security. I'd make coffee, set the table, and he'd come in with that calm smile, asking how I'd slept. Our children would laugh in the kitchen as we talked about the week's commitments. It was a routine that brought me peace, a life that, in my eyes, represented exactly what I'd always dreamed of: a solid home built on faith, trust, and commitment. At church, we were known as the inspiring couple. People would ask for advice, wanting to know our secret to maintaining such a harmonious marriage. I'd answer with conviction. We pray together, we serve together, we dream together, and I truly believed it. Behind the scenes, however, there were small details that I can see clearly today. The phone always faced down, the messages answered too quickly, the unexpected commitments that arose midweek. But back then, I saw no malice. My mindset was one of absolute trust, and any suspicion felt like an attack on the values I defended. It was like living inside a well-told story where the hidden truth remained protected. Behind smiles and rehearsed gestures, the impact of the discovery was so devastating only because my journey there had been marked by total surrender. I held no reservations, left no gaps. I believed that love and fidelity were guaranteed for those who lived under God's blessing. But real life doesn't follow perfect scripts. There's a silent side, one no one wants to show, where wrong decisions are hidden and justified to save face. Back then, I never imagined that one day I would be questioning everything. The words spoken at the altar, the promises made before God, the image of perfection we displayed. Today, I understand that when we place people on a pedestal, we risk ignoring signs that are right before our eyes. And when the mask falls, the shock is even greater. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because before talking about the night that everything changed, we need to understand how a relationship can deteriorate silently, even when, on the outside, it seems intact. Perhaps you, too, once believed that by following all the tenets of faith, nothing could go wrong. I believed with all my being that living according to the Word, respecting my vows, and honoring my home was like building a wall against any threat. My mindset was simple. If I did everything right, if I remained faithful, if I put God at the center, then my marriage would be protected. And for a long time, this gave me a sense of protection, as if no storm could touch us. This belief gave me the strength to face life's common challenges, but it also left me vulnerable to something I hadn't realized: false security. When we think we're immune, we start to let our guard down. I didn't question absences. I didn't investigate subtle changes. I didn't leave room for doubt. I convinced myself that everything had a logical explanation, because the hidden truth seemed impossible to someone who claimed to love me and share the same faith. Behind the scenes, however, small clues were piling up. A different exchange of glances, an exaggerated care with the cell phone, conversations interrupted when I entered the room, things that, in isolation, seemed like nothing. But together, they created a scenario I didn't want to see. I wasn't just avoiding confrontation. I was clinging to the image I'd built of my marriage, because admitting any cracks would mean rethinking my entire journey up to that point. Today, I realize that back then, my decisions were guided more by the fear of loss than by the courage to face it. And this is something many women experience: the attempt to preserve what seems perfect, even if it costs them their own peace. The impact of this is profound, because without realizing it, we move away from ourselves, molding thoughts and feelings to fit a standard that no longer exists. I continued like this for months, believing I was protected, until a single moment was enough to shatter that illusion. A moment in which all certainties crumbled and that, unexpectedly, would reveal much more than a simple betrayal. A revelation that would begin that night, but whose consequences would take me a long time to fully understand. That Saturday night, the church was lit differently. There was an air of anticipation, as if everyone was about to experience something special. The couple's service was always highly anticipated: decorated tables, soft lighting, praises that spoke of love and commitment, words that warmed the heart. I arrived holding his hand, wearing my best smile, feeling that this would be another night to strengthen our alliance. I looked around and saw other couples exchanging knowing glances, some younger, others already married for decades, all connected by that atmosphere of communion and celebration. During the hymns, I closed my eyes and thanked God for our story. I didn't know that, as I gave thanks, my life was about to change irreversibly. He sang beside me, but something about him seemed distant, almost imperceptible to outsiders. That detail, however, was like a spark that ignited a restlessness within me. Small things began to catch my attention: the phone vibrating discreetly in my pocket, the quick glance at the screen before putting it back, the way he changed the subject when someone approached. I tried to focus on the message being preached, but my mind was beginning to wander to the background of that night. It was as if a part of me knew there was a hidden truth trying to reveal itself, and I was fighting the thought of listening to it. With each praise, each word about unity, my heart alternated between gratitude and a strange sense of alertness. I remember holding his hand tightly, as if this gesture could anchor our connection, as if it could dispel any shadows that were gathering. When the service ended, many couples remained, chatting, laughing, and making plans for new encounters. I smiled and participated, but I felt a weight I couldn't explain. It was as if my journey at that moment was divided between two realities, the one everyone saw and the one I was slowly beginning to sense. And it was precisely in that gap between what seemed perfect and what actually happened that something happened and completely changed the course of that night. It was as we began to leave the room that I realized most clearly he was there, but he wasn't. His smile was automatic. His answers came too quickly, as if he wanted to end any attempt at conversation before it could begin. His gaze wasn't the same. It lacked that sparkle of someone sharing the moment. He seemed to be crossing the room without really seeing the people around him. And I, who had so often interpreted his silence as introspection, this time felt something different. It was as if there was another scenario happening behind the scenes, invisible to everyone, but leaving subtle marks on every gesture. As some friends called him to take photos, I noticed he held his phone tightly, almost like a shield. He responded to messages with his body slightly turned, shielding me from view. When I asked if everything was okay, I heard a dry yes, accompanied by a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. That was the first visible crack in the image I carried. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my mind start to piece things together. I still tried to keep my mind focused on the good, pushing away uncomfortable thoughts. I told myself it was just fatigue, that maybe he was worried about something at work or ministry. After all, wasn't that how I always handled any situation? Seeking to justify it, give the benefit of the doubt, avoid jumping to conclusions? But there was something about that night that kept me from simply moving forward, a silent presence, as if the hidden truth was just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As we said goodbye to everyone, I noticed he avoided long conversations, as if he were in a hurry to get out of there. This brought me a strange uneasiness, a premonition that, at the time, I couldn't explain. And at the same time, a part of me struggled to ignore the obvious, perhaps out of fear of the impact it would have on my life, perhaps because I knew, deep down, that some revelations are irreversible. And it was in this internal conflict between the desire to believe what I knew and the need to face what was to come that the next scene of that night began to form before my eyes. As we walked to the car, that feeling of disconnection only grew. I talked about small details of the night, but he responded with short sentences, as if trying to end any dialogue. Deep down, my heart was already starting to prepare for something I couldn't name. It's funny how sometimes we feel before we understand. This is where I want to open a parenthesis with you, listening now. If this story is affecting you in any way, if at any point you found yourself trying to decipher signals like this video, it seems simple, but every like helps this message reach more people who may be experiencing the same pain in silence. It's like creating an invisible support network, where every gesture counts so these stories don't remain hidden. Looking back to that night, I remember how the silence between us felt too heavy to be just about exhaustion. It was the kind of silence that holds decisions already made, truths unspoken. And even though I didn't know what was coming, something inside me already understood that this journey was about to change direction. It was during this break in the quick conversations and hasty goodbyes that a friend approached me with that unnatural smile. She hugged me, commented on the service's message, and, almost as if speaking without thinking, blurted out a phrase that echoed in my head. "Oh, I saw you two have been talking a lot late at night. It's nice to see the couple so close." She said that, and then quickly walked away to talk to someone else, as if she'd just made a casual comment, but her words stuck in me, like a pin that, however small it may seem, stings with every movement. At that moment, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and alertness. I couldn't recall any late-night conversation that could justify that comment. My mind began to search through recent memories, trying to make sense of it. Was she referring to some exchange of messages in the church group? Or was she talking about something I didn't know? The more I tried to rationalize, the more I realized there was an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe she wasn't talking about me. Maybe she was referring to him, not us. The impact of this thought was like a silent snap. There was no proof, no accusation, just an uncertain yet disturbing feeling. Still, I kept smiling at passers-by, as if nothing had happened. I didn't want to give rise to suspicion, not at that moment. But internally, something was beginning to shift. It was as if that sentence had shifted a key, peace in my mindset, opening the way for other questions to emerge. As we drove home, her sentence repeated itself in my mind, taking on new meaning each time. The road seemed longer than usual, the sound of the radio filling a silence neither of us cared to break. I glanced at him every now and then, trying to decipher expressions, gestures, any sign that might reveal what lay behind the distance I felt. It was as if I were about to enter an unknown part of my own journey, a territory where hidden truths would begin to reveal themselves and where every detail would carry a different weight. It was in the midst of this heavy silence, as I stared out the window at the road, that something inside me awakened, almost physically. It wasn't just a thought. It was as if the Holy Spirit nudged me, deep down in my soul, whispering that there was something I could no longer ignore. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't insecurity. It was that gentle but firm conviction you feel when you realize you need to pay attention because something isn't right. Suddenly, the past few months began to flash through my mind like a fast-paced movie. The excuses for arriving late, the short work trips, the subtle shift in tone in conversations, the way my phone never left on the table. I hadn't connected these dots before, because my mindset had always been to trust until the end. But in that moment, I realized that perhaps that trust was being used against me. My body was reacting before I even understood. My heart raced, my hands sweated, and a mixture of sadness and alert settled in my chest. It was as if I were standing before a closed door, and on the other side lay a hidden truth that I wasn't yet sure I wanted to know. Because deep down, we know that certain revelations change everything, and there's no going back. I remained silent, watching his every move, the way he kept his gaze fixed on the road, avoiding looking at me for too long, the way he changed the radio station soon as a more romantic song came on, as if to avoid any emotional triggers. All of this made me feel like it wasn't just my imagination. There was a journey happening parallel to mine, decisions being made behind the scenes, far from my knowledge. In that moment, I understood that my life might be about to split into two parts, before and after that night. And although I had no concrete proof, my intuition told me I was very close to finding something that would completely redefine the way I viewed my marriage. When we got home, something was still bothering me, almost physically, like a constant pressure in my chest. I tried to distract myself, but that restlessness seemed to pull me back to the details of the night. I remembered the moment in the service when he had left the pew to join in the praise. His cell phone was on the chair, and without planning anything, I simply felt the need to pick it up. It wasn't premeditated, it was instinctive, as if a silent force were saying, "Look, now." I grabbed the phone and went to the church bathroom, where I could have a few minutes alone. My hands were shaking, and at the same time, there was a part of me that wanted nothing to do with it, because doing so would mean facing a new reality. When I unlocked it, the first thing that appeared was a message notification. It wasn't a strange name. On the contrary, it was someone I knew, someone who attended the same services, who had sat at our table for Sunday lunch. The conversation was open. The words weren't direct, but they carried a tone that left no room for doubt. Messages sent late at night, sentences full of intimacy and complicity that had long since disappeared between us. I read and reread each line, as if my brain were trying to find an alternative interpretation, something other than the obvious. But there was none. It was the raw truth, stripped of all disguise. My heart was beating so fast it seemed to echo off the bathroom walls. I looked in the mirror and saw a version of myself I hadn't yet recognized. Wide eyes, pale face, the expression of someone who'd just stepped through a door into another world. And it was there, in that small, coldly lit space, that I realized the image I'd held of my marriage had just crumbled. I closed my phone, took a deep breath, and returned to the temple. He was still on the pulpit, singing, and for a moment the scene seemed surreal. From the outside, onlookers would never have imagined what I had just discovered. And as the sound of instruments filled the room, within me began a journey of forced transformation, where every decision from that point on would carry a completely different weight. What followed was an uncontrollable whirlwind. My heart felt like it was about to leap out of my chest, each beat so strong I could feel it in my ears. My hands were shaking so much I had to intertwine my fingers to try to hide it, as if I could contain the tremor that revealed more than I wanted to show. The air seemed denser, and for a few seconds I felt like the world around me was spinning in slow motion as I tried to maintain a neutral expression. It was like being caught between two worlds, the one everyone saw on the outside and the one I knew had just happened inside me. The voices in the room, the keyboard chords, the people singing, everything sounded distant, almost muffled, as if I were listening underwater. The impact of that discovery wasn't just emotional, it was physical. I felt a weight on my chest, a pressure that made it difficult to even breathe properly. Every step I took back to the bench felt calculated because I feared any sudden movement would betray the chaos taking over me. When he returned from worship, he smiled at me as if nothing had happened. I responded with a discreet gesture, and within that gesture lay 1,000 things he didn't yet know I knew. I wasn't ready to confront him there, not in that setting, not in front of everyone, but at the same time, a part of me was already beginning to mentally reorganize itself, like someone who knows they need to make quick decisions to avoid losing control of the situation. I sat, crossed my legs, and kept my eyes fixed on the stage, but inside, I was replaying every detail of those messages, every word that carried the weight of a veiled betrayal. It was as if I could feel the invisible thread connecting that other person to him, and the thought cut through me like a blade. In that moment, I understood that it wasn't just about breaking a vow, but about the transformation this revelation would bring to my life. And as the service ended and everyone prepared to leave, I knew the night still held revelations that went far beyond what I had just read. When we finally left the church, the cool night air hit my face, but it brought no relief. We walked to the car in silence, as if each of us carried a weight beyond words. My legs felt heavy, almost as if it took a conscious effort to move. Getting in, I closed the door slowly, as if any louder sound might shatter the fragile control I still had. He put the key in the ignition, but didn't start the engine immediately. He stared straight ahead, his hands firmly on the steering wheel, and I could tell that, in that moment, he knew something was different. There were no screams, no explosions, just a dense silence, filled with everything that wasn't being said. My eyes began to fill with tears, and as much as I tried to hold them back, I felt the first one trickle down the side of my face. It wasn't a loud cry, but a silent cry, the kind that carries more than pain. It carries awareness, insights, the beginning of an inevitable transformation. He glanced at me quickly, as if to gauge how much I knew, and then looked away. I still didn't have the courage to speak the words stuck in my throat, but every second in that parking lot seemed to stretch time. Inside me, there was a mixture of sadness and clarity. Sadness for what I had just lost, and clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. My mind raced in slow motion through every detail of the night. My friend's comment, his strange behavior, the text messages, the way he sang from the pulpit, while inside me, something crumbled. The silence between us wasn't an absence of sound. It was the presence of a hidden truth that filled the entire space. It was as if we were sitting in the same car, but in different worlds. I took deep breaths, trying to organize my thoughts, as I sensed that this would be the turning point in my journey. And even without knowing how or when, I knew that from that point on, every decision I made would define the course of my life. He took a deep breath, like someone preparing to walk through a door, unsure of what they'll find on the other side. Still not looking at me for long, he let out a heavy sigh and said, "I need to tell you something." His tone held no defense, no ready excuse, just a weight that seemed to drag each word down. I stood still, feeling my body react before my mind. It was as if the air inside the car had grown denser, and every second of silence between one sentence and the next amplified the impact of what was about to come. He continued, his words tearing at the little ground left beneath my feet. He told me he'd been involved with someone else for months. It wasn't someone distant. It wasn't a name I'd never heard. It was a sister from the youth group, someone I'd greeted with hugs in the church, hallways, who'd once sat at our table, who knew our children by name. Hearing this wasn't just painful for the act itself, but for the level of closeness and trust that had been broken. As he spoke, my mind flashed backstage scenes I hadn't seen before. The encounters that likely took place after rehearsals, the late-night messages exchanged, the calculated decisions to keep everything secret. Every detail he revealed was like a piece of a puzzle I'd never intended to put together, but which now formed before me with disturbing clarity. I didn't cry anymore. There was a strange, almost cold calm replacing the initial despair. It wasn't resignation. It was a change of mindset, an immediate adaptation to a new reality. As he tried to explain, saying it hadn't been planned, that things just happened, I realized how flimsy these justifications sounded compared to the enormity of the choice he'd made. Because betrayal isn't a stumble, it's a sequence of conscious decisions. Deep down, I knew that conversation wasn't the end, but the beginning of a series of revelations that would completely transform my journey. And although the pain was intense, there was also the seed of a new strength that I didn't yet fully understand. As he spoke, and each detail began to fit into a narrative I never imagined I'd experience, I felt that this story wasn't just mine. What was happening there, in that car, had already happened or could happen in the lives of so many other women. So, if you're listening to me and something resonates with you, whether because you've been through something similar, know someone in a similar situation, or even feel like you're experiencing signs you can't interpret, please leave your comment here. Sharing your thoughts and feelings isn't just about telling a story. It's about creating a space where other women can realize they're not alone. It's in this dialogue that we find strength, support, and even new perspectives that can make a difference in the most difficult times. He, still in a low voice, tried to fill in the gaps that remained, but the more he spoke, the more I realized that most of the answers I sought wouldn't come from him. I would have to find them within myself, in the silence of my own reflection, and that was a revelation as harsh as the confession itself. In the days that followed, the news spread silently but relentlessly. I didn't need to tell many people. The very dynamics of a closed community took care of that. When I returned to church on Sunday, I realized that nothing was the same. Looks came from all sides, some filled with curiosity, others with disguised pity. And there were also those who seemed to want to gauge the extent of the damage, like someone observing an accident from a distance, but unable to look away. The most painful thing wasn't the direct questions, because almost no one had the courage to ask them, but the hushed whispers that ceased as soon as I passed. It was as if my presence became an uncomfortable reminder that the perfect image could crumble at any moment. The smiles, once warm, now had a hint of artificiality. I could tell when they were genuine and when they carried an implicit judgment, the kind that doesn't need words to hurt. It's strange to realize how, even within a space that preaches compassion and support, there's a tendency to observe the suffering of others with a certain detachment, almost as if it were someone else's story, something that doesn't connect with one's own life. But the truth is that behind this facade, there were comments being made behind the scenes, distorted versions gaining traction, malicious interpretations being accepted as fact. This environment made me understand that betrayal itself is devastating, but the weight of public judgment has an impact that's just as profound, if not more profound. It's as if, in addition to dealing with personal pain, you have to manage a narrative others are creating about you. And often, this narrative becomes crueler than reality. I realized that my journey from then on would not only be about overcoming what happened in my marriage, but also about facing how the world around me would see me. And as I walked those hallways, feeling every glance a silent reminder of my new condition, I began to realize that the fight for my truth would be as intense as the pain I carried. Amidst all those looks and whispers, what struck me most was the moment when some church leaders called me in for a chat. I imagined it would be to offer me support, prayer, perhaps a space to vent. But no, the words came measured, careful, almost rehearsed. "Sarah, it's best if you don't say anything about what happened, so as not to scandalize the church." For a moment, I thought I'd misunderstood. What do you mean, say nothing? As if silencing my pain was a way of protecting something bigger, more important than the truth itself. They explained to me that exposing the situation could create divisions, alienate members, and hinder God's work. And it was at that moment that I realized the glaring contradiction. I was the open wound, but also the one that needed to be hidden to maintain the appearance of health. This profoundly affected my mentality. It wasn't just the betrayal I needed to process. Now, I also had to deal with the pressure to protect the image of a community that at that moment didn't seem concerned about protecting me. This imposed silence had a suffocating weight. It was as if they had placed me in a dark room and locked the door, hoping I would heal on my own, but without making a sound. Behind the scenes, conversations took place, versions were multiplied, but I had no right to tell mine. And somehow, this hurt even more because it robbed me of the only power I had left, the power to tell the truth. I began to realize that my journey wouldn't just be about overcoming marital betrayal, but also about confronting structures and mindsets that, even with seemingly good intentions, perpetuate silence and isolation. And as each day passed, this tension between what I knew and what I was told to hide became unbearable. As the weeks passed, I realized that the silence I'd been asked to maintain was turning into a wall around me. Friends who were once always around began to distance themselves. The messages dwindled. The invitations to lunch or meetups simply stopped coming. It was as if my presence caused discomfort, as if I carried an invisible mark that reminded everyone that not even the most seemingly solid stories are immune to cracks. At first, I tried to justify these absences. I thought maybe it was just a temporary situation, that people were busy, that everything would soon return to normal. But I soon understood that this was no coincidence. There was a weight to the interactions, an excessive care in the words, and even some glances that seemed to be gauging my reaction. Behind the scenes, I realized that there were those who chose to believe the stories circulating, and others who, afraid of getting involved, preferred to stay away completely. The impact of this on my ministry was even more profound. Suddenly, the activities I'd served in for years were interrupted. They told me I needed to take time off to recover, but deep down I knew it was just another way to keep me in the background, out of sight and out of conversation. The place where I used to find purpose and connection became a space that reinforced my loneliness. This isolation wasn't just social, it was emotional. I felt surrounded by invisible walls, separating me from a community that, until recently, had been my spiritual family. I felt like I was watching everything from the outside, like a spectator in my own life, watching people go about their daily lives while I struggled to cope with the silent transformation taking place within. And each day, this distance forced me to reflect on who I truly was without all. The roles and connections that had previously defined me. Nights began to become my greatest challenge. When the house finally fell silent and there were no more distractions, I found myself alone with my thoughts, and it was at this point that the internal struggle with God intensified. I would kneel on the bedroom floor, often unable to form sentences, simply letting the tears flow as the weight on my chest seemed to increase. My prayers were punctuated by sobs, as if I were trying to find words for something I didn't even fully understand. I asked why, as if the answer could somehow reassemble the remaining pieces. I wanted to understand what it meant within my faith, within what I'd always believed about promises, commitment, and divine care. But the silence I received in return felt deafening. It wasn't that I doubted God's existence, but there was a sense of distance, as if He were watching me from afar, waiting for me to get through this part of the journey so He could reveal what would come next. The early mornings were long, sleep elusive, and when I finally did, I woke with my heart racing, as if I'd dreamed something I couldn't remember, but which brought back the full weight of reality. Often, I'd return to my knees, searching for some sign, some relief. I felt my faith being tested not only by betrayal, but also by the lack of clear answers. There were times when I tried to recall verses that had always given me strength, but even they seemed distant, as if shrouded in fog. It was unfamiliar territory for me, a mixture of devotion and disappointment, hope and weariness. And in the midst of this confusion, I began to realize that the transformation taking place within me depended not only on the answers I wanted to hear, but also on the questions I was willing to ask. There came a time when the feeling of emptiness became almost unbearable. It wasn't just physical loneliness, but that bitter feeling of being rejected everywhere. I walked through places that once brought me peace and felt like I no longer belonged there. At church, eyes seemed to pierce my skin, as if trying to find hidden flaws. At home, the silence weighed down like an invisible wall, and deep inside, there was a constant question. Had even God turned His face away from me? It was a strange feeling, because I knew, rationally, that God doesn't abandon me. But emotionally, it felt like my prayers were hitting the ceiling and bouncing back. I relived every moment of my faith journey, trying to figure out where I'd gone astray, if I'd done anything to justify that situation. My mind sought answers, while my heart simply wanted rest. This low point made me see things I hadn't seen before. Conversations that were once full of affection now featured short, formal phrases, as if people no longer knew how to address me. Old friendships dissolved without explanation. Even family members, trying to avoid conflict, began keeping their distance. It was as if I carried a label no one wanted to be around. The most painful part was feeling like my identity was being shaped by the situation, not by my essence. The betrayal not only broke up my marriage, it triggered a series of reactions that left me marginalized from what I considered my life. And even though I knew it didn't define who I was, the constant pressure almost made me believe otherwise. In this scenario, I began to realize that if I wanted to survive emotionally, I would need to find a new way to rise up. Not to prove something to anyone, but to reclaim my own voice amidst so many external voices trying to define me. It was on a silent dawn, when the sun was barely touching the curtains in my bedroom, that something inside me began to shift. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar weight on my chest, when an old memory came to me. A sermon I had heard years ago, where the pastor said, "God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all." That phrase echoed as if it were the first time I truly understood it. For the first time since everything had happened, I realized clearly that God was not the author of the betrayal, nor the creator of the silence that suffocated me. This revelation was like a slap in the face. I had spent weeks wondering what I had done wrong to deserve this, almost as if I were waiting for a divine explanation to justify the pain. But in that moment, I understood that my vision had been distorted by the wound. The truth is that his infidelity was the result of human decisions, conscious choices made in the shadows, far from the light. And the church's silence was not the voice of God, but the result of fragile structures, of mentalities that prefer to save face rather than embrace the wounded. Realizing this, I felt a strange relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I was still hurt, there were still open scars, but something in my perspective began to shift. It was as if I had finally separated my image of God from the flawed attitudes of others. This didn't lessen the pain, but it gave me a foundation to move forward without feeling spiritually abandoned. In the days that followed, I began to look back and see signs I hadn't previously interpreted that way. Moments when God had sustained me without me realizing it, small details that protected me even in the midst of chaos. The unexpected conversation with someone who encouraged me, the verse that appeared just when I was on the verge of giving up, the silent embrace from a stranger that made me feel seen. None of this came from the people who told me to shut up. It all came from his presence, which exists regardless of circumstances. This realization gave me the courage to reevaluate not only my faith, but also the way I was living my own story. I understood that part of my transformation would involve taking the lead in my journey without allowing other people's mistakes to define my identity or dictate my future. I no longer needed to live as if I were beholden to others' expectations, nor as if I were responsible for keeping intact a narrative that had already been shattered. From that point on, my prayers began to change. They were no longer just pleas for the pain to pass, but sincere conversations about the next steps, about decisions that would need to be made with courage and clarity. I asked for discernment to recognize when something was from God and when it was just the repetition of human patterns that I no longer needed to accept. And the more I prayed like this, the more I realized that the strength I so desperately sought would not come from a single moment of relief, but from a constant process of rebuilding. It was a timid, almost insecure, new beginning. At first, entering the therapist's office felt more like an act of survival than a courageous step. I sat there, with cold hands and a choked voice, trying to explain pains I couldn't even name. But little by little, that silent room became a place where I could be whole, without masks, without fear of scandalizing anyone. It was as if each session removed some of the debris that time and circumstances had accumulated around me. Therapy didn't give me ready-made answers, but it did give me back the ability to ask questions I hadn't dared to ask before, and that was essential to rebuilding my mindset. At the same time, I found refuge in a small group of people who weren't interested in keeping up appearances, but in walking together. They weren't old friends, and perhaps that's why they didn't carry the weight of judgment I'd felt before. They were people who truly listened, who didn't interrupt to offer quick advice, but let silence work when necessary. With them, I experienced for the first time in a long time a sense of genuine belonging, one that doesn't demand perfection as a condition for being close. These encounters, simple and without rehearsed scripts, had the impact of restoring something within me that rejection had tried to erase. And then came the most unexpected part, returning to reading the Word, but with new eyes. Before, I read as if seeking immediate answers to ease the pain. Now it was different. I read to truly know God's heart, not to confirm what I thought I knew about Him. I discovered passages that had previously gone unnoticed, and that now seemed to come alive before my eyes. It was as if each verse were an intimate revelation, a direct message showing that God's truth is not molded by human errors. And the deeper I delved, the more I realized that this wasn't just reading, but a process of silent transformation, shaking the roots of what I believed about love, forgiveness, and justice. There were days when therapy touched on such deep wounds that I'd leave exhausted, feeling like I had no strength left to continue. But it was precisely on those days that an unexpected conversation in the small group or a passage read in the morning would remind me that the healing journey isn't linear. It's full of ups and downs, revelations and setbacks, and instead of beating myself up for not being healed all at once, I began to value each step, even the slow ones, as a legitimate part of the process. This phase also taught me something about the behind the scenes. Many of the most important changes don't happen in front of others, but in the silence of everyday life. It's when you choose not to entertain certain thoughts, when you decide to forgive once again, even if you don't feel like it, or when you decide to get out of bed and get on with your day, even though the weight remains on your chest. These small decisions, unnoticed by anyone, are the ones that truly build the foundation for transformation. And it was through this combination of therapeutic encounters, sincere hugs, and underlined pages that I realized that healing isn't a final destination, but a different way of walking. It's waking up and knowing that, despite the scars, there's still life to be lived. It's accepting that some answers may never come, but that this doesn't prevent the heart from finding peace. And as I assimilated all this, a new chapter began to unfold. Making the decision wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly feeling relief. It was more like walking down a narrow, dark hallway, where each step echoed with the weight of memories and unanswered questions. For a long time, I associated divorce with absolute failure, as if it were proof that I wasn't capable of upholding something I'd sworn before God and others. But as my healing journey progressed, I realized that wasn't the whole truth. The hidden truth, the one unsaid from pulpits and church aisles, is that sometimes the greatest act of fidelity you can perform is to your own life, not to the image others expect you to maintain. It wasn't an impulsive choice. It was the result of sleepless nights, of written and torn pages from my diary, of conversations in which my voice trembled but wouldn't shut up. I knew that choosing to rise again meant accepting that some doors would have to close before others could open. And in that moment, divorce wasn't a cry of, "I give up," but a firm whisper of, "I deserve to live in peace." It was the decision to break a cycle that drained my soul before it completely erased who I was. My mindset began to shift when I realized that protection isn't selfish, that setting boundaries isn't a lack of love, but an act of courage that preserves what's still pure within us. This understanding didn't come overnight. It was built in silence, behind the scenes, as I said goodbye to expectations that weren't mine, but that I carried as if they were. The impact of this decision was profound, not only in my life, but also in how I began to see the stories of others who carried the same burden, but remained trapped, believing that liberation was a sin. There was resistance, of course, whispers louder than words, looks that tried to read within me a guilt I was no longer willing to bear. Friends who disappeared without explanation, and others who, to my surprise, reached out, offering silent but firm support. I discovered that in moments like these, you learn not only who is by your side, but also who you truly are. And this revelation, painful as it was, became a necessary filter for the next chapter of my life. I remember one specific day when signing the papers felt like closing a scene in a movie no one had ever seen in its entirety. From the outside, it seemed simple. A document, a pen, a deadline. But inside, it was a mixture of grief and liberation. I cried not because I doubted my decision, but because I was burying a dream that had once been real to me. And acknowledging this was part of the process of honoring my own story, without erasing it, but without allowing it to hold me captive. After that day, the sensation was almost physical, as if a weight had been lifted that prevented me from breathing deeply. Not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because I had made the choice that, at that moment, was the only one capable of keeping my essence intact. I was finally free to rebuild, and this rebuilding was unhurried. There was no ready-made script, no guarantees, but there was the certainty that continuing was better than remaining where nothing else flourished. And perhaps this is what many people don't understand. Getting back on your feet isn't about going back to who you were before, but about allowing yourself to be who you haven't yet met. It's about accepting that the journey of transformation requires decisions that, at first glance, seem like losses, but which deep down are investments in your own life. And as I walked in this new direction, I realized there was so much more to be revealed. Rebuilding my identity after everything wasn't like gluing together the pieces of a broken vase and trying to make it look new. It was more like accepting that some fragments would never return to their original place, and that, in the empty space that remained, it was possible to create something entirely different, perhaps even more beautiful. At first, there was a sense of estrangement. I looked at myself and didn't quite know who was standing in the mirror. Without the title of wife, without the label that had for so long defined how people saw me, and in a way, how I saw myself, I felt like I was in unfamiliar territory. But little by little, this unknown began to reveal itself as fertile ground, ready to be explored. It was during this process that I realized how much my identity had been constructed on external expectations. I didn't see myself as separate from these imposed definitions, and when they fell away, I had to face the question I'd always avoided. Who am I when no one's looking? The answer didn't come quickly. It emerged in small things, in a coffee taken alone, without rushing, on a short trip, decided on the spot, on a day of silence, without having to explain anything to anyone. These small experiences began to rewrite my narrative, not with the goal of erasing the past, but to affirm that it had no power to imprison me. There were days of relapse, of course, moments when loneliness felt like a narrow, dead-end corridor, and I wondered if I was truly on the right path. But in those moments, I learned to remember that love and worth aren't measured by marital status, that being alone doesn't mean being less, and that the absence of a ring on my finger doesn't diminish what's most precious about me. This new mindset was like an antidote to the silent guilt that tried to return from time to time. Gradually, I began to realize that rebuilding wasn't just about seeing myself in a new way, but also about allowing myself to be seen that way. I stopped trying to adjust my story to fit others' needs, and when conversations began to veer toward judgment or comparison, I chose not to participate. This decision, though simple, was liberating. It was as if each time I refused to buy into a narrative that didn't represent me, I was reaffirming, I know who I am and I don't need to prove anything. The curious thing is that in this process, I began to see myself with more compassion. Before, I judged myself with the same harshness I received from so many people. But as I distanced myself from these voices, I realized that I could be the first to embrace myself. I began to treat myself as I would someone I love, with patience, care, and room for error. This was one of the greatest revelations, that rebuilding one's identity necessarily involves rediscovering self-love. There was also a rediscovery of faith. Unfiltered by guilt or fear, I began to read the words that had previously sounded like condemnation and found them filled with grace. It was as if God was showing me that He never defined me by my marital status, but rather by the fact that I was His daughter. This simple yet powerful truth reshaped everything. It became a foundation for me to position myself in life without bowing to the pressure of fitting back into a mold that no longer serves me. And so, what at first seemed like a wasteland became fertile ground. I began cultivating new passions, investing in areas I'd previously ignored, surrounding myself with people who weren't there out of convenience, but because they genuinely cared. It was as if, little by little, I was painting a new canvas, in no rush to finish, but with the joy of seeing each color take shape. The certainty of being loved and valuable, regardless of any title, took root in a way that could no longer be uprooted. This new identity wasn't a reconstruction to please, but a blossoming to live. And, in the midst of this process, I realized there were still more layers to uncover. And it was in this fertile ground that something I hadn't planned for was born, but which made perfect sense when I realized it, transforming my pain into a bridge for other women to cross. It wasn't just about healing myself anymore, but about using my story as a beacon for those still lost in the fog of fear and guilt. I began to realize how many women carried burdens that weren't theirs, suffocated by distorted discourse and the silence imposed on them. It was as if, by listening to me, they found not only understanding, but also permission, the permission to question, to feel, to free themselves. Gradually, I understood that my mission wasn't to convince anyone, but to open safe spaces where tears weren't seen as weakness, and where vulnerability was met with respect, not judgment. This led me to deep conversations, the kind that start out shy, but soon reveal hidden truths. I discovered that, behind practiced smiles and memorized phrases, there were hearts begging for rest. And that's how my personal journey intertwined with that of so many others. As I shared the behind-the-scenes story of my own transformation, I realized that each story I heard further fueled the flame of purpose. It wasn't about exposing wounds, but about showing that they can heal, even when the scars remain. It was about changing mindsets, challenging imprisoning narratives, and offering new lenses for seeing oneself and God. Over time, I realized that this mission wasn't sustained solely by fine words or profound reflections. It required real presence, a willingness to walk alongside others, the courage to face disapproving looks, and the determination not to back down when the impact disturbed those who preferred silence. And in this commitment, I found a strength I didn't even know I possessed, because helping other women free themselves from guilt isn't just an act of empathy, it's an act of resistance. It's a refusal to let fear and shame be the storytellers. And it was along this path that I realized there was still so much more to be revealed, and it's impossible to look back without feeling the weight, and at the same time, the lightness of this journey. Weight, because each scar carries the vivid memory of nights when faith felt like a thread about to snap. Lightness, because as I crossed the valley, I realized that it wasn't me holding God. It was He who carried me, even when my feet no longer had the strength. There's a hidden truth that only reveals itself in vulnerability. His faithfulness is not measured by circumstances, nor by what we feel in the moment. It is constant, silent, and often imperceptible, until one day, without warning, we realize we're still standing. It wasn't easy to accept that the pain I faced wasn't a reflection of God's character, but of human decisions. This discovery has a profound impact, because when we stop blaming heaven, we make room to see His hand at work behind the scenes. That's how, even surrounded by rejection and injustice, I found signs of care in the little things. An unexpected message, a hug that arrived at just the right time, a passage of the Word that seemed to have been written just for me. That's why, if you're experiencing something similar, I want you to know that God's silence doesn't mean absence. His faithfulness is like an invisible anchor that keeps our hearts steady when everything around us is shaking. I've learned, firsthand, that His character doesn't change because someone was unfaithful or because a human promise was broken. And understanding this changes our mindset because it frees our faith from being conditioned by immediate answers or visible results. This journey has shown me that His presence is not only proven in extraordinary miracles, but also in the ability to keep breathing, loving, and believing, even after being hurt. When I look back on the path I've traveled, I realize that each step was part of a silent but radical transformation, and that even in the moments when I thought I was alone, He was shaping something within me. And it is in this awareness that I find the strength to continue, because I know that there are still truths to be revealed and paths that will only be understood when they are lived. And perhaps it's precisely because I've navigated so much darkness that I understand today the importance of keeping this conversation alive, of not letting stories like mine remain hidden in the shadows of life, stifled by fear or the weight of guilt. Because I know that, for many women, simply hearing someone say, "I know what it's like," can become the turning point, the spark that rekindles hope. That's why I can't keep this to myself. This journey isn't just mine. It carries a greater purpose, a mission that goes beyond my own healing. When I share, I'm not just telling a story. I'm building bridges so that others can find a safe path through their valleys. If you felt that this message somehow touched a sensitive corner of your heart, know that it wasn't by chance. There are women who right now are in the exact same place I was, trying to understand where they lost their joy, wondering if they'll ever smile without fear again. They don't have to walk alone. And this is where you too can be part of this transformation. Sharing this message isn't just spreading words, it's sowing seeds of courage in places where hope seems to have fallen silent. It's bringing light to those who haven't yet seen a way out, showing that yes, it is possible to start over. When you send this video to someone, you're not just forwarding a link, you're actually holding the hand of someone who might be on the verge of giving up. You're saying, without words, you're not alone. There is a path, and I want you to see it. The impact of this goes far beyond what we imagine, because each woman reached can later reach others, and thus the cycle of healing and empowerment expands in an almost invisible, yet profoundly real, way. This is how a simple gesture becomes a movement. And if what you've heard so far has awakened in you a desire to continue listening to real stories, full of revelations and hidden truths that are rarely spoken aloud, then this is the time to connect even more closely with this community. Because each new content that arrives here is not meant to entertain, but to provoke mindset shifts, bring clarity where there is confusion, and show that there is beauty even in the most painful stages of the journey. By subscribing, you become an active part of this space, not as a distant spectator, but as someone who chooses to stand alongside those struggling to rediscover their strength. This exchange, this connection that is built, is what keeps the flame burning, because life is made of stories, and each one has the power to light someone's path. Sometimes, it's exactly the phrase you needed to hear that arrives at the right moment, and other times, you're the one who delivers that phrase to someone else. It's this intertwining of lives and experiences that strengthens us, that reminds us that, even in times of pain, there is an invisible network of support, formed by people who may never meet in person, but who share the same desire to see others rise again. And that's why I'm still here, sharing and listening, learning and delivering, because I truly believe that every step in this direction opens the door to more healing, more freedom, and more transformation. And there's still so much we need to talk about.